Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our council meeting for September 23rd. I'll call the meeting to order, and we'll start with our first item of business, which is, of course, the adoption of the minutes of the council meeting held September 4th, 2013. There's a recommendation there, moved by Councillor Lefebvre, seconded by Councillor Morrison. Any changes, errors, omissions? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. We're now moving to approval of the agenda. We do have a change, ladies and gentlemen, in our agenda this evening, and I'm going to read a very brief recommendation. Would like some support. And that's that agenda item 3B, consisting of the delegation by Ermineskin Tribal Enterprises regarding the Agricultural Land Reserve exclusion application be removed from the agenda, and that the September 23rd, 2013 council meeting agenda be approved as amended. So we've had one delegation drop, in effect. Moved by Councillor Powell-Davidson, seconded by Councillor Neufeld. Are there any other additions to the agenda? I know there's a few items for new business, but those don't need to be included now. Anything else? Okay. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Just canceled. All right, moving on. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, we're now in the delegation phase of our meeting this afternoon, and we have one delegation this afternoon, and that is from McDonald Gray Consultants, and it's regarding the proposed rezoning application 780 Stanhope Road and 577 Pym Street. So I see the representatives here. Did you want to come forward and make your presentation? You know the drill.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, and the floor is yours.
So as our application is in front of Council tonight, we thought we'd do a quick follow-up to the original presentation that I did 3 or 4 months ago, just to get it back to the top of mind. So very briefly, I am referring to the project at 780 and 577 Pym and Stanhope Road and Pym Street. It is a zoning amendment, loosely based on the city's SLR1, the small lot zoning. These are really intermediate lot sizes, as you'll see in the staff report. Subject property is located at the corner of Pym and Stanhope Road, identified here in red. You can see the current zoning context. So what surrounds the site is some comprehensive development, small lot across the road now on this site, and the balance is RS1 single family. So in terms of OCP land use designations, and this has been updated to the current OCP, transitional residential and single unit residential surround the site. There's single unit residential along east, west, and south property lines. So the proof of concept on the right illustrates why we're seeking this zoning amendment, and the purpose is to change from RS1 to a small lot zone. As you can see here, one of the ideas, one of the key parts of this project is the relocation of an existing home and the justification of a lot around the second existing home, so adaptive reuse of those buildings. So that portion of the site indicated in yellow will not be a rezoning. It will strictly remain RS1 single family. Green portion of this map shows just a portion of the site that's being dedicated as a pathway. I'm just going to go through this really quickly because you've seen it before. As it stands right now, what we're seeking is part SLR1 and part RS1, which would allow for 15 units on the property, as compared to RS1 single family, which would allow for 12 units. And this is just to do a few more adaptive things and build on the small lot zoning in place in the city. So we did discuss this the last time. We're just trying to increase housing choice in our area. The pathway dedication has been provided on our plan proof of concept. In terms of park, I did mention before there is no real desire in your parks master plan for any of these more of these neighborhood pocket park sized parks. So we'd be wanting to do cash in lieu instead of a park dedication. We are intending to do a fire department contribution, which I believe is in the report that you have in front of you. And in terms of infrastructure for this property, everything will be built and paid for by the developer at subdivision for this site. In terms of form and character, we have been to design panel with these form and character drawings as well as a building scheme draft reviewed by the panel. I'll touch on that in a minute when I come back to it, but you can see here you can fit a very normal intermediately sized family home on these lots. So it's not a true small lot, it's more of an intermediate size, moderate lot. So this is just the update section of my presentation. So essentially we prepared a building scheme, presented to the design panel. We also took that building scheme out to the public at a public engagement session that we had here at PCCC on July 17th. The people that attended there were neighbors adjacent to the site, and they had some issues that they raised. In terms of the city request, planning did request that we provide a restrictive covenant limiting the lot size to not less than 425 square meters. So that is about roughly midway between small lot and full-size lot sizes. Very similar to what you're seeing in Qualicum for what they deem small lot these days. That covenant is now with planning, and I believe you have a copy in your report as well. So in terms of our public information meeting, there was expressed concern about having second-story windows overlooking a lot of what are patio homes adjacent on the single-family sites. So in response to that, we added some language to the building scheme, which you can also read in your report, restricting those windows that would overlook rear yards to a frosted bathroom window application only. Mitigate those privacy and lot value concerns with the neighbors. And that is it, very briefly. Thank you, Your Worship.
All right, thank you, Mr. Race. So, as always, I'll open it up to Council if you have any questions or not. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Worship, and thank you, Nigel, for your presentation. The BC Hydro has just announced a potential 26.9% increase or 4% increase in hydro rates. Any thought to looking at other kinds of things for the development in terms of solar for hot water heating and that sort of thing?
I don't think we've proposed anything that would be a statutory requirement of the building scheme, just because we can't in talking to the lawyer. But I would say that on most, if not all of our projects, we are recommending to our clients, the owners, and the future home builders that they install solar-ready features in all the homes. As you know, it's not cost prohibitive, so we do recommend that in every case.
Is somebody doing a cost-benefit analysis now that their hydro rates are going to be going up and up and up and up?
Honestly, not on this project as of yet, as we're still going through rezoning, but I estimate that when we get to subdivision, that will definitely happen.
Follow up, Your Worship. The City of Vancouver is looking at new building code changes to cope with aging, I guess, for lack of a better term, or accessibility. And they're looking at wider doors, grab bars in the bathroom, lower light fixtures, and roll-in showers and that sort of thing. Anything, I guess they'd be built to spec, so that would have to be a request of the potential buyer.
They will be built to spec, knowing our demographic and our market demand type, and talking to the design panel. It's definitely something the owner is considering at this point.
Further questions from members of Council? Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship, and thank you very much, Mr. Gray. Could you put a couple of slides? I was interested in how the RS1 is going to stay in two instances as far as the location and how we're changing the rest of it. Could you...
Apologies, I'm not familiar with the Microsoft platform.
Okay.
So this is the slide you're referring to.
So in fact, there's a building that is there currently, and that's the one you're pointing to at the present time. There's another building that in fact is down lower on Pym Street that you were in fact going to be moving up to the other yellow slot on the right. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. And then what you're doing is you're putting in, and they're staying as RS1, and then you're bringing into effect the small lot residential as far as the rest of it is concerned, and you're putting in that one walkway through to the now. I guess the question that I would have, and we will come to it when we come to the report further on, but I would Could you be available to have that up when we have the discussion later in the evening, please?
Sure. I'll leave the presentation up.
Thank you.
Did you want to take this opportunity to ask the question while we have
Well,
him?
I think the question would be for Mr. Russell.
Okay.
And I guess there are a couple issues that I have there, but I think it would be more appropriate when we address the
Okay.
issue at
Yeah,
the time.
that's
Thank you.
your prerogative. No problem. Any further comments, questions from members of council? Go ahead, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Worship, through you to Mr. Gray. Thank you for coming today and for taking the time to explain and refresh our memories. The sketches you showed of the buildings, a little bit of landscaping, yeah, that one there. Am I correct in seeing there that you have double bay garage so that can fit 2 cars, or is this the sort of piggyback effect where they have one in the garage and one parked outside?
Thank you. It's a really good question. These illustrations are just to show that it's possible to fit the homes we intend within the zone on the lot sizes we proposed. So this is not necessarily going to be a home that's built, but it's designed to show design panel it is possible to fit these on the lot. Personally and professionally, I'm not a huge fan of snout houses having the garage forward, but market demand does dictate those things. Within the building scheme, we have some language that insists that those garages be set back from the main building entry, just because it's one of the peeves of our design team to see that. So the first thing you will see in all of these homes is that front articulation of that front main entry, and garages will be set back a minimum of 2 feet from that.
Just a follow-up?
Go ahead.
I appreciate what you said, and that's good information, but I'm not sure if I made my question clear. Will the homes that you build accommodate side-by-side parking, or will they be that other term, and I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but sort of the piggyback or inline parking?
That would be called tandem parking, and no, these don't require that. So all these homes could have garages for full 2-car garage should they choose to do so. Yeah.
All right. Further questions or comments? All right. I don't see any further questions or comments. Thank you, Mr. Gray. And, of course, we will be discussing this again later in tonight's agenda. And when I said tonight's agenda, that was a mistake. I don't anticipate being here until actually tonight, just so everybody's aware. Moving on to correspondence. We have one item of correspondence tonight, and that is from the Kingsley Low Rental Housing Society, and it's a request for support for affordable housing project at 312 Hearst Avenue, and you have a recommendation before you. All right, so we have the recommendation moved by Councillor Lefebvre, seconded by Councillor Powell-Davidson. Is there any discussion? I see Councillor Lefebvre. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, given what this organization is trying to do, the Kingsley Low Rental Housing Society, and knowing the availability of any kind of rental, much less low rental society, I'm in fully support of this request. I guess I can leave that for under new business to make a notice of motion.
That would be an appropriate time, absolutely. Right now, this recommendation, ladies and gentlemen, is simply to receive the correspondence. Go ahead, Councillor Neufeld.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. I realize that this is only correspondence, but in fact I have a question or two for the Chief, if I could, with respect to this.
Yeah, by all means.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Chief, with respect to traffic and access onto this location, I've tried to come to some understanding. In looking at the diagram of flow of traffic, I expect that if you have the same diagram that I do. Okay, the traffic inflow and out is on the right-hand side. There's a driveway going in underneath the building, for that matter, and to the back. You have no problems as far as access and traffic flow, and as far as emergency services going in there. And both you and I know you can't answer for the RCMP, but I would expect they would have given their approval if you have given approval. Your Worship, through to Councillor Neufeld, the access to this site
most cases, emergency vehicles will be parking on the street and we'll be stretching lines in. There's no point, can't get our fire trucks down into the underground parking anyways, so access will be, I don't foresee an issue with it at all.
Okay.
I guess this will not be underground parking, though, will it? It will be, in fact, service parking? No one can answer that. Okay.
Just a suggestion. I'm guilty of it myself a lot, but I noticed when you're speaking to him, microphone's not picking you up. So for some folks, especially those viewing at home, the many thousands I'm sure that are watching, they may have a hard time hearing it. It's a little blop. So essentially, the question was related to access. The chief indicated he doesn't have any significant support, and that it's fairly typical in these circumstances to stretch hoses in because they're constraints and underground parking, etc.
I guess there was a follow-up to that in that the parking goes right to the lot line. There's no requirement for setbacks and that type of thing. I mean, this is only correspondence, so we'll be dealing with that in the future.
That's exactly right. This is a fairly early stage, and you can see in the correspondence they're mostly looking for fee relaxation, and then, of course, as you go through that process, these exact questions will have to be raised. And
well, I am in support of this, Your Honor, Your Worship, and I would quite willing to have this accepted, and we'll go forward with it. Thank you.
Well, I anticipate a motion that you probably could second at new business here, it sounds like.
I would move that it has been?
Well, Councillor Lefebvre suggested he was going to raise it at new business. That would probably be appropriate given the agenda.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right, so we do have the motion to receive. Is there any further comment? Okay, all in favor, opposed, carried. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're now moving on to our reports section tonight, and the first report is from our fire chief, and it's regarding the renewal of automatic response agreement. Chief Banks, did you want to give us a little bit of background, please?
Yes, Your Worship. This report is to, as you mentioned, renew our automatic aid agreement that we had established for the last 5 years. The Dashwood has asked to get in on the automatic aid agreement as well. So with the renewal, it was a good time to look at that. So that's what the report covers, and the recommendation is as the agenda.
All right, very good. And of course, in that report, there was some discussion about fees, but they have not been collected to date, I understand. And I would take it your position is that it's more important that we have solid mutual aid agreements in place.
That's correct, Your Worship. Over the course of this agreement, we had a cost recovery in there, and part of the cost recovery was to cover manpower and equipment costs. To date, that has not been necessary. There's still some cost recovery in there for consumables and that. We consider this report just an extension of our mutual aid agreement, which doesn't have any cost recovery in it at this time. Getting the equipment to the scene is the big priority. A lot of the impetus of this automatic aid agreement was to cover off a lot of the care facilities and that, where manpower is essential to the outcome of an incident there. So some of the other departments looked at the cost recovery, and they weren't, while they may have been the benefactor of them coming to us more than us going to them, they weren't interested in the cost recovery for manpower and equipment. So to move this forward, that was removed with the consent of all the parties.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. So we do have a recommendation before us, and I'm looking for a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Morrison, seconded by Councillor Powell-Davidson. Further discussion from members of council. Councillor Newfound.
Thank you, Your Worship. Chief Banks, you've gone over the cost recovery and the fact that it's primarily geared as far as the automatic response for the care homes in Qualicum Beach and in Parksville and Coombs, and they, I can see this all being worthwhile. You automatically go out to the incident whenever the situation occurs. The issue that I would have for as far as cost recovery, you know, and you've addressed part of it, but what if there's a horrific accident or something of that nature as far as our vehicle that goes out, whether it's a truck or an appliance, whatever it might be? Are we not covered for our insurance? Do we have insurance? Maybe I should address that to Mr. Manson. What is the coverage that we would have as far as cost recovery for damages here, sir?
Your Worship, through to Councillor Neufeld, in cases like that, the insurance would be covering most of it. There is a clause in there that wherever we're going out to, whatever jurisdiction we're going to, there would be like a $5,000 fee that basically offsets some of the deductible. But for incidents like that, the insurance would be the mechanism to get the recovery.
All right. Further questions, comments? Well, I tend to agree with you, Chief. I think, you know, it's a little bit scratch our back, we scratch yours, and let's make sure that we have the resources in place to save lives, and that's clearly the priority here. And if no further comments are coming forward, all in favor, opposed, and that's carried. Thank you. All right, moving on to Report B, ladies and gentlemen, and this will be from Mr. Russell, and it's regarding, of course, the follow-up report, Zoning and Development Amendment Application to facilitate a residential development of intermediate-sized lots, 780 Stanhope Road and 577 Pym Street. Mr. Russell.
If I may, Your Worship, the staff report outlines basically information update for this application. The proponent held an open house. They collected correspondence at their open house. Those have been attached to the staff report, as well as draft covenant and developer's building scheme. So it's really just an update of information for this application that proposes to amend the zoning from RS1 to SLR1 to potentially facilitate 2 to 3 additional lots and may otherwise be achievable under the underlying zoning.
Okay, very good. So I know there were some questions, I believe. So let's get the recommendation on the floor, and then during that discussion phase, I'll make sure that any questions are put forward. So moved by Councillor Lefebvre, seconded by Councillor Morrison. So it's on the floor. Questions, comments? Go ahead, Councillor Neufeld.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you very much, Your Worship. I voted against this one that came up in, I think it was June 17th. And I've looked at this further, and I'm still somewhat concerned about it. There seem to be a number of issues with respect to the second floor windows and the covenant that's going to be put in place. I think that we've known from past experience covenants don't mean a great deal, and privacy for those people that are going to be backed onto, if you will, from bathrooms or from other windows. Do have a concern. There are issues there that we should possibly take some exception to. I don't know the extent to which planning can be involved so that there would be a blank wall against the adjacent properties. But I'm somewhat concerned about this. The covenant, in my opinion, seems to not mean a great deal. Covenants in my section of the city mean nothing as far as wind roofs and the covering on the roof, whether it's shingles or shakes or whatever. And so it does have an impact as far as your ability to control form and character, the privacy issues that are there, and I have some difficulty also with the aspect of the number of properties being put up here. I can still see a nice development being done with a lesser number of lots, and I don't see the requirement to go to the small lot residential. I have not changed my opinion in the 3 months since I voted against it at that time. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I'm looking at you, Mr. Russell. There was one I did note in the initial public open house, if you want to call it that. There was some concerns expressed about the second stories. I know Mr. Gray addressed that It's my understanding under RS1, which is the current zoning, it does fully allow for two-story homes, I believe. Could you confirm that, Mr. Russell, just at one point?
If I may, Your Worship, you are correct. Under the current RS1 zone, maximum building height of 7.5 meters is permitted, which would facilitate two-story single-family dwellings.
Okay, so that might be relevant to the privacy side of it. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I'll direct my comments through you to Mr. Russell, Director of Community Planning. First question I have is that this, my reason for supporting the project is that for me it's extremely similar to Wembley Place, which is about a block and a half away from this location. And Wembley Place itself is quite elevated compared to where the existing homes are in Belson. Am I correct in that? I mean, I've had a look at that the other day, and it seems to me that there's a great deal of similarity, except that Wembley Place is quite a bit higher than Belson. And the density is certainly greater than what's being proposed here.
If I may, Your Worship, I believe that to be the case. However, I think some of it's relative depending on what side of the property you're viewing it from.
My follow-up question is along the lines of Councillor Neufeld. With regards to covenants, what is the city's authority during the construction process in getting the covenants respected? Are there fines imposed? Are there required changes that must be made under the law?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Neufeld, there's actually two different kinds of legal. Councillor Lefebvre, I apologize. There are actually two types of legal documents being registered on title. So one is a covenant, and the covenant is a document that's expressly limiting the size of the lots to no less than 425 square meters. It also is the same document that contains the prohibition on having second floor windows that aren't frosted facing exterior to the overall site. That is fully enforceable through the Supreme Court of British Columbia. The city is a signatory to that document should the application be successful, and any enforcement of that document would be through the court system. With respect to a developer's building scheme becomes subject to the parties that buy into those properties, and they're enforceable amongst themselves should a party who's a member of the future property decide to take action.
Follow up, Your Worship.
Go ahead.
So in that case, when a house is being built and for some reason the building inspector notices that the windows aren't frosted, there's a change order that can be requested, and an occupancy permit could be denied until that has been installed. Is that correct?
If I may, Your Worship, to Councillor Lefebvre, the matter would have to be brought before Council to seek Council's willingness to enforce the matter.
Further questions and comments? Go ahead, Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick comment. Given that the small lots makes a lot of sense in my eyes, in the fact that if you go to the larger lot size, you're also going to allow a larger size home, making it much more difficult to have rear-facing windows that are frosted. If you have a larger floor plan, you're more likely to have bedrooms and things upstairs rather than or at least rear-facing bedrooms. And also with the tax base that we can expand upon, they're not as small as the latest lots that we've approved, so I'm in favor of this.
All right, thank you, Councillor Morrison. Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a couple of things. I like the proposal because for numerous reasons, one of which is that our new OCP does actually require or recommend that we do have some diverse housing options, and certainly smaller lot subdivisions do meet that criterion for being more diverse, but also, while not affordable housing by any stretch of the imagination, the smaller lots would allow for people like first-time home buyers or seniors that are downsizing to be able to get into something that was less expensive, say, than the traditional larger size homes and larger size lots. Also, I'd like to point out that as the council liaison to the advisory design panel, I did sit in on this presentation and was, the recommendations that were made by the advisory design panel were for the windows at the top to be addressed. They approved this to go forward to council. They also did talk about the form and character, which is primarily what they are concerned about at the ADB, the Advisory Design Panel, and it was conforming at that time. The recommendation here is simply to move this forward for public hearing. Is that correct? So that the residents can get a clear picture of what's being proposed?
Yeah, just for the benefit of anyone in the audience that may not be all that familiar with these processes, because what we're talking about is an amendment to a zoning bylaw. In effect, there is a statutory process involved which requires a public hearing, and the latter part of this recommendation would initiate that process, and the first part of the recommendation is simply receiving the information. So, yeah, absolutely, we would be back here after with a better understanding, at least in terms of what the public's input was at the public hearing, should this move forward. Go ahead, Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. I guess the problem that I have with this, sir, is that you know, if we're talking about seniors housing, affordable housing, when I look at this, the issue is such that with a smaller number of lots, in fact, what you wind up having was the possibility of going to a second floor, at least a single floor with a smaller number of lots. You have it not as much carriage as far as tax is concerned, as far as rebate to the city, but in fact you maintain the privacy, and you maintain the opportunity for people to live in it, as far as families, as far as seniors are concerned, on one floor without any requirement to utilize a second floor. I think that with stairs, although they can be beneficial as far as exercise and knee joint lubrication, but in fact people are moving away from that. They want the ability to live on one floor, and even though an RS1 would allow a second floor, in fact, in many cases, people are moving to a rancher style, and I think that this was what would be appropriate. I don't see the requirement to move to a greater number of 12 to 15 lots. All we're doing is creating a benefit for the developer, and without, I see very little payback for the city. There's an increase in utilization of water. There's an increase in utilization of services, and there's no payback, in my opinion, to give this individual an additional 3 lots for you know, a gross profit. Thank you.
All right, Councillor Neufeld. The only element of that I'll touch on, because of course this is again an area where we have full discretion based on our own views. There is general provisions within our OCP that talk about densifying, specifically infill developments, which does generate higher assessed values and ultimately more tax revenues for the city. But I won't get into the sort of back and forth as to whether that's a benefit or not. Certainly your prerogative to choose as you will. Go ahead, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a point of clarification from me. Based upon some of Councillor Neufeld's comments, I'm concerned that maybe I didn't come across very clearly, and I might have insinuated that I believe this to be affordable housing or senior housing, in which, in fact, I consider it to be neither. I consider this to be another housing option that may possibly appeal to you know, younger families that are looking to get into the home market at a more affordable rate for themselves, as opposed to the traditional housing that we already have. So I just want to make sure you were clear. I'm not confused that this is senior housing or that this is affordable housing, because I don't see it as either. Specifically, I see it as housing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and it's an area where, you know, affordable housing is sort of a relative term. I can assure you that the houses in Parksville are absolute bargains compared to the houses in Vancouver in terms of their price. So it's all relative, but I get you, and there's a difference between attainable housing as well. We still need to go around some more. Go ahead, Councillor.
Very, very briefly, Your Worship. I'll be watching for some innovation with regards to energy and water. When we see where this project goes, and I think it's time. And I'll have some reservations if I don't see some advancement in that regard, because it is becoming an issue, and for the potential buyers, the whole issue of operating costs for a house with regards to things like water and things like electricity are going up and up and up. So I'll look to see if there's any breaking of the glass ceiling in that regard.
All right, thank you for that, Councillor Lefebvre. So I don't see any further hands in the air, in which case let's call a vote on the recommendation. All those in favor and opposed? And that is carried, so we're off to a public hearing on this matter. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're now moving to Report C, which is, again, from Mr. Russell as an introduction, and that's the consideration of a development variance permit, 803 Sunray Close.
Okay, for Mayor Worship, so we have an application where the applicant is reading a variance to the minimum lot size depth provisions as outlined in the zoning bylaw. The applicant is requesting to vary that depth from the standard 30 meters to a depth of 16.1 meters. Should the variance be granted and subdivision proceed, the result will be the creation of a new lot that is less deep but wider than the typical parcel. This will provide a minimum building envelope that is 27.9 meters wide or 91.5 feet wide by 5.6 meters or 18.37 feet deep.
All right, thank you, Mr. Russell. So we have a essentially recommendation before us. This is again a recommendation that would initiate a statutory process because it is a variance request. And I see Councillor Lefebvre moving it and Councillor Morrison seconding it, and I'll open it to discussion. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Worship. Just a comment. It's interesting to note that in reading the report by staff, that what the property owner wants to do is wants to build two single-family dwellings on the lot, and yet in the report it states that a second dwelling in the form of an accessory carriage house could be constructed on the existing parcel in the location shown. I gather that's perfectly within the legal rights of the owner to do so. So in this instance, I would hope that when giving the good folk, the information about this particular request for a development variance permit, if you're against having two houses on the lot, and you vote against it for that reason, you could still end up with a carriage house, and the end result would be you still get two houses. So I think that becomes important for the public at large to know that, because there seems to be an issue here that by denying this demand for a development permit, you'll only get one house on the lot, and that may not be the case.
All right, thank you, Councillor Lefebvre. Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship, and thanks very much for bringing that point up, Councillor Lefebvre. In fact, if you look on page 65 of 110, there's the Hodgson carriage house that's referred to as a carriage house for that matter. And so I looked at that and I thought, okay, this is what is planned to be put in there. And I don't know where they got that plan from. It seems to be shown exclusively for that particular lot because of the way that it's set back and it's the way that it's indented all the way back. But I look at that and I say, fine, put a second house on there. I have no problems. But what I'm concerned about is that you keep it as far as one lot. It is one lot. It is presently one lot. And if the person chooses to put a carriage house on it and have an income property there, let them do so. I would, given the size of the lot and I guess the form and character of the properties in that lot, I went over and I spent 3/4 of an hour driving around through there, looking at the Sunray Close and Sunray Road and the area last night, and I have problems with subdividing the lot. If the owner presently wants to put on at least a second dwelling, such as the carriage house, for an income purpose, then fine, let him do it. He's within his right to do so. I would not like to see it split.
All right, thank you for that, Councillor Neufeld. Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a question through you to our Director of Community Planning, and I'm referring to the bottom of page 60, Mr. Russell, where it says, the very last sentence, neither council nor the approving officer are bound by this encumbrance, but may take it into consideration. That is in reference to the building scheme contains a clause that states no lot of the said plan may be subdivided. So my question to you is, when this building scheme was designed way back in the early 70s, it went into place for a reason. I'm wondering, have there been other examples over that time where lots were subdivided in this area? And if you wouldn't mind to answer that question first, it may influence my next question.
Mr. Russell?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Powell-Davidson, I'm not sure if I can fully answer your question because obviously I wasn't there, or I was 1 year old when the building scheme was put in place, so I wouldn't know what was in the developer's mind. But it would really be a proposal that was put forward by the developer of the day to establish the kind of look and feel for the development that they were proposing. As far as in other areas, I'm not aware of any specifically in Parksville, but I am aware that in similar situations in other jurisdictions, building schemes are really between the parties at hand, and council nor the approving officer is bound by it.
Just to follow up to that question, if I may, Your Worship.
Go ahead.
In this particular development, I'm presuming there are other lots in this particular development that would qualify for a subdivision, or a subdividing, I should say. Have we, to the best of your knowledge, have we received over the years any other applications to subdivide any of the lots within this particular neighborhood?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Powell-Davidson, so this property is part of one subdivision just on Sunray Close, and I'm unaware of any other applications for subdivision that are part of this one street.
Okay. Further questions or comments? Go ahead, Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. To answer Councillor Powell-Davidson's query, in looking at it last night, I think this is the only lot that would in fact be available for subdivision, just because of the layout of them. A lot of them go back on a pie-shaped basis with a wedge at the front, and this is the only long one. The one that is presently opposite on the roadway stretches out for a long rancher, so that it would not, to subdivide it would have to raise the building and go through a subdivision process, and then you would have possibly two lots there. But to answer Councillor's question, this is the only one that is presently available to do so. I have one other question that I would have, and that's with respect to the Sustainable Community Builder Checklist. Really quite concerned about the timber on this property. There are three stands of mature trees, which would probably be knocked down if this project went forward. The fact that there would be a significant impact on the environment, we would lose, I guess, a certain envelope of natural trees. These are the types of trees that produce a tremendous amount of air, cleansing, and they're absolutely spectacular. So that when we look at the environmental protection and enhancement, the way that the Sustainable Community Builder Checklist has been completed, I would say, is erroneous. The fact that we wind up seeing rocks and drought-tolerant plants being put in would be virtually useless compared to what the trees are that are presently there. These are just the comments that I would make after having examined the lot myself last evening. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just trying to wrap my head around some of the questions or comments that Councillor Neufeld had. I just wanted to see if I could ask a clarifying question to Councillor Neufeld. What benefit do you see in allowing him to go through this plan as a carriage house as opposed to subdividing it as two lots, ending up with exactly the same thing?
Did you want to answer that, Councillor Neufeld?
If I may, Your Worship, thank you. Unfortunately, he has the right to do so. And unfortunately, we would suffer the consequences of that with respect to suffering from the demolition of the removal of the trees, the change of the escarpment and change of the form and character of that property and around the close. It would be the only second two-story house that is there. I think that there are. I would prefer to see, a second carriage house there, and in conjunction with the form and character of the houses that are presently there, and be entirely satisfied. I think that could be done. I would prefer to see it done than have a completely new severed lot that removes all of the trees, and they might have to be removed anyway. But I would rather go the way of working with what we have rather than what there could be as far as a second lot there.
All right. You're clarified. Very good. Thank you. So, I don't see any further hands in the air. Again, a vote in favor will give notice that we intend to vary this, and of course we will be back here with some additional input, I'm sure. So, all in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. Okay, moving forward, and this is now Report D, ladies and gentlemen, from our Director of Community Planning, and it's regarding the consideration of a policy to require developers of major land use projects to make a presentation to Council. And there is a recommendation simply to receive at this time. All right, moved by Councillor Neufeld, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Now, I will open it to you, Mr. Russell, very quickly, although I think the main proponent of this is actually unfortunately absent, probably because of our afternoon meeting, and I know that she was very adamant, Councillor Powell was very adamant that we have a better sense of what's going on when we have presentations, or rather applications of a nature that are significant. And there is a staff report there with some options available. So did you want to add anything to that, Mr. Russell?
If I'm Irish, I believe the report is pretty self-explanatory.
All right. So go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre. Was your hand up? You were the mover. So go ahead, Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. I'm fully in agreement with Councillor Powell. I was really happy to see her. I could even hug her for it. And the fact that I would like to see the option that staff has put forward as far as option 2, considering a policy that requires applicants for all rezoning and OCP amendments to make a formal presentation to Committee of the Whole or Council prior to commencement of the statutory process. I think that that's really critical so that we get an understanding of exactly what is going to be done. I find it frustrating at times that a conceptual plan is being presented, and giving approval of variance or an OCP amendment is just galling in the sense that you don't know what is going to end up there.
So, Councillor Neufeld, did you want to make a motion to amend the recommendation to include that component?
I'm saying I'm quite happy with option 2, and I would.
That would require a motion to amend the resolution right now.
Fine.
If you make that motion, we can speak just to that component.
I would like to amend the motion to accept option 2.
And that would be essentially that, and that the draft land use application policy number 4.31 attached to informing Schedule A of the Director of Community Planning's report dated September 13th, 2013 be adopted as council policy. Is that correct?
Right.
You saw the attached report. That would make it basically a condition of these processes coming forward. Okay, do we have a seconder for that amendment? Okay, so we now have an amendment on the floor. Speaking only to the amendment, is there any further comments? Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Worship. I had the same reaction that when we talk about major land use projects, the difficulty expressed in the report is how would you define what a major land use project, and I like the option of number 2. I guess my question is, what are the consequences would there be consequences if a proponent didn't didn't make a presentation to council, would that automatically make it null and void, or what kind of legislative authority do we have in enforcing that would be a requirement?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Lefebvre, with a rezoning application or an OCP amendment application, council has discretion to deny an application at any stage in the process. So if someone under the policy chooses not to present, then it would be entirely at council's discretion to deny the application if council so wished in order to enforce that policy.
So we have a lot of power in that regard. All right, so we have an amendment to the motion in front of us. Is there any further comment to the amendment? Go ahead, Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Given the listing of how many developers presented to council, very few didn't. And I think it's obviously in the developer's best interest, and I think Mr. Gray would probably agree, given the fact that he's now come twice to make sure that council is clear on his projects. I see this as redundant. The comment that Councillor Neufeld made about the conceptual drawings and being frustrated, it's still going to be conceptual drawings. The presentations aren't going to change because, like has been listed in here, most of them have been presented to us already. So I don't see this as something that's required, and I agree with staff that I guess hard to differentiate what major projects are.
Yeah, certainly, although the amendment that's being discussed right now, I think, kind of avoids that question of major and ties it specifically to the various processes that we undertake. Okay, so Councillor Lefebvre on the amendment.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to know from staff, and I omitted to ask this question when I had my turn. Are any other municipalities, do any other municipalities have this practice or do this as a requirement?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Lefebvre, I am unaware.
Okay, so Councillor Powell-Davidson, I'm going to call it on the amendment only. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. Before we do vote on the amendment through you to the Director of Community Planning, the recommendation for today was simply to receive the report, which is what we asked you to do, prepare a report, and thank you for doing that so quickly. My question to you, Mr. Russell, is it sounds like many of us, myself included, looked at option number 2 and felt that was, the direction to go. I guess what I'm concerned about, if the report has come to us with a recommendation to receive it, and I'm not even sure if you can answer this question, is it too soon to be voting on a definite option, especially given that we are missing 2 members of our council? Should we maybe stick to the agenda and just vote with receiving the report at this point? Are we pushing ahead too quickly?
No, we have a quorum, so we are going to continue to undertake city business. You can certainly vote against the amendment if you simply want to receive the report. It's conceivable it could come back at a later time. That's certainly an option available to you. Or you could support the amendment. Staff have gone so far as to draft a policy, though, so there was some looking into this, and some discussion obviously is reflected in the report. So right now, though, we're just simply on that amendment. So why don't we call a question on that, and if it survives, then you can still vote against the motion in its entirety as amended, or it can carry forward if it doesn't survive with simply a receipt, and we could certainly bring it back at a later time, I presume. Okay? All right. All those in favor of the amendment? Opposed? All right, so the amendment carries. Now, on the main motion as amended, any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion? All right, so I registered for, and sorry, Councillor Morrison, are you opposed? I didn't call opposed yet, so that was unanimous. All right, so that was unanimous. Thank you. All right, Mr. Russell, moving on to item E, and this again is a report regarding the application to exclude land from the Agricultural Land Reserve, Pym Street, Ermineskin lands. Did you want to give us the background, please? Yes, the actual report is done. Just the delegation is not attending. Go ahead, Mr. Russell.
If I may, Your Worship, so on June the 24th, 2013, the city received an application to amend the the Agricultural Land Reserve boundary In accordance with Provincial Agricultural Land Commission Act and associated regulations, the proponent posted notice of the intent to remove land from the agricultural land reserve on the subject property. The application includes a proposal to remove 11.2 hectares of the 35.9 hectare property from the ALR and to include into the agricultural land reserve 3.85 hectares along the property's southern boundary. So this report now outlines that application process.
All right, thank you for that. That was a rather substantive report outlining a whole number of areas. There is a recommendation before us, ladies and gentlemen, to essentially receive that report, and I'm just going to read it because this is a fairly big item, and that a resolution be passed to reject the applicant's request to forward the exclusion application to the Agricultural Land Commission for its consideration with a number of numbers tying to specific properties. So, all right, so we have a motion, Councillor Powell-Davidson, seconded by, I'll give it to you, Councillor Lefebvre, and I'll open the floor to discussion on that recommendation. All right, Councillor Lefebvre, then Councillor Neufeld.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I wanted to, first of all, congratulate staff on what I consider to be an excellent report, very thorough, and it covers all the bases as far as I'm concerned. In supporting this request, I wanted to talk about some of the other areas that augment the issue of food and water. And I think that that's, for me, that's the basis of what this is all about. And I can't think of anything more fundamental than food and water. And I put this out there hoping that the proponents will look at this as a request, at least on my part, to have a great deal of collaboration on what might happen with this land, this very important piece of land in our community. And we learned that the Union of British Columbia Municipalities last week, we went to, I think a lot of us attended a seminar where the advice that was given is just don't say, well, he said or she said, or I heard this from somebody and somebody else said something. Try to get specific about your quotes. So if you'll permit me, Your Worship, I would like to, because it is a very important issue, I would like to refer you to a little bit of research that I did. And it's there was a social and economic benefit study put on by the, I want to get this organization right. It's a study by the BC Association of Farmers Markets and Professor David Connell, a professor in the School of Environmental Planning at the University of Northern British Columbia. And according to the study that, the economic benefit study, the estimated total economic benefit of all farmers markets in BC in 2012 was greater than $170 million, a 147% increase from the results of a similar study completed in 2006. And the total direct sales grew from 46 million to 113 million over the same period. Connell noted that the findings are significant for many reasons, including highlighting the improved viability of local food systems, increased demand for new farmers, and the pressing need to protect the agricultural land base. So, and it goes on to talk about other statistics in terms of places like Squamish, the Squamish market, which injects more than $1.8 million annually into the local economy and draws nearly 60,000 visitors annually. Shoppers are spending more money, with average customer spending growing 23% to $28.81 a day. So my understanding of this is that agricultural land is going to become more and more important and no doubt more and more valuable. So in supporting this and in looking to the future in terms of, again, using water and looking at food, I see this as an extremely important area, and I would offer up in the spirit of collaboration that we look upon this, and if the proponent does intend to farm, we would work together to see what the benefits would be. We have a local businessman in the community who is going to be opening up a retail store very shortly, and his objective is going to be selling local produce. I had a discussion with him not so long ago, and he's been going around to all of the local farmers saying, if you've got produce to sell, come to my store and I'll sell it for you. And of course, we all know that in this particular report that I've been referring to, more and more people are buying locally grown food. It has greater nutrients and greater value, and they're prepared to pay more for it. So I'll leave it at that, Your Worship. And again, I fully support the recommendation made by staff.
All right, thank you, Councillor Lefebvre. Go ahead, Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. I'm, as Councillor Lefebvre has said, he's fully in favor of it, as I am. I think of the opportunity to save our wetland, to save our water system, if not to actually save it, but to prevent any contamination occurring, but also to have a greater fulfillment as far as food is concerned. I go up to that area. I know I'm trespassing, but in fact, everybody trespasses on it. The kids trespass, so they have a great time on it. But the reason that I go for is the blackberries. I'll tell you, the blackberries are so big and so succulent in August. I collect enough so that I have sufficient there till February, March. I freeze them, and they're great. And it is a productive land. It can be productive, and it doesn't have to be underwater as far as cranberries are concerned. You can do things up there and have a marvelous farming community. I don't say blackberries are going to be the only thing that would be possible, but that land can be productive, and you don't need a lot of herbicides, pesticides, this type of thing. You can, in fact, make it entirely a clean, organic product and get some good food production out of that area. Maybe not sufficient to pay for the cost of the Ermineskin tribe having held it for 32 years, but in fact they're paying less than 50% taxes on it anyway. My comment. I think we have to go forward with this as far as the denial of the exclusion. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. Further comments? Do you have a comment? Go ahead, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. For everything that my colleagues have expressed and the fact that it's so close to our watershed, it's valuable land, the history that we've had in trying to purchase that, still believing that that's a good piece, a good fit for us, but also having the ALR in our own boundaries as a extremely active supporter of local food production and food security in our community. There's absolutely no way in heck I can support this coming out of the ALR, and I'm very, very pleased with the report that staff have done and the recommendation, absolutely supporting this recommendation.
All right, thank you, Councillor Powell-Davidson. Let me just make a quick comment, and then I don't see any other hands up, we'll call it. If I just sort of take us back a little bit further out and just look at, again, what the report really touched on in quite detail. An offer of land in a case like this is never a bad thing, obviously, but there has to be a rationale associated with it. We have a property, again, that's outside of our urban containment boundaries. Of course, it's also in the ALR. And it's in an area of the city, actually, where we have some pretty significant land base for residential development specifically. In fact, there's a fairly major project now beginning and underway in that general area of the city. For me personally, because it's the only strength we really have in our regional growth strategy, I'm completely adamantly opposed to extending urban containment boundaries. That is supposed to be the definition between the urban areas and the rural areas. And for that reason alone, I would have a hard time supporting a project, even if there was no ALR component involved, although in this case there is. But following up on Councillor Lefebvre's comments, I think there actually are opportunities on this site, and I get a sense from what I've heard around the council table, there's some willingness to look at potential opportunities that could involve any number of things, and again, a lot of that's outlined in the report. And something council may want to consider, you also see that there as an option, and you could do this under new business, not specifically related to this application, but there is an additional farm bylaw that one could bring into place to further qualify and quantify the sorts of activities that are okay and close to urban environments, and that might be something to consider. Getting back to this application, though, I will be supporting the recommendation for the reasons that I expressed. Okay, so I'll call it then. All in favor, opposed, and that's carried. Thank you. Moving on to Report F, and this is from our Director of Administrative Services, and it's regarding the White Paper on Local Government Elections Reform. Mrs. Comas, did you want to give us a little bit of a background on that?
Yes, Your Worship. The purpose of this report is to provide information to Council regarding proposed changes to local government election legislation, particularly where it concerns campaign financing and reporting requirements. The provincial government is currently soliciting comment from elected officials about the proposed changes to be submitted by October 23rd. The recommendation is as per the Council agenda. If Council wishes to submit comment, a further resolution directing staff to do so is required.
All right, so there is that option, Council. I know you're all familiar with this white paper. It was the subject of much discussion at our recent UBCM convention, and there is simply a recommendation there to receive. Is someone prepared to move that? Okay, moved by Councillor Morrison, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Any discussion on this? Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Worship. In attending one of the seminars on the white paper, and this is it, it's 98 pages long, and anybody that's interested, I think we've got extra copies. I'd gladly loan it out to somebody. My only suggestion would be that before the next municipal election, I think it would be incumbent on the city to put out some sort of a mini training session on the new regulations that are coming into play. Because, for example, one of the things that I learned is that as someone who accepts no contributions to my campaigns, I still have to acknowledge the fact that I've made the contribution, which I never did in the past. So I think there's a lot of little things like that that don't seem to make sense to me. But if you don't accept any campaign contributions, but that's going to be the law when this is brought forward, unless there's some changes made during the white paper discussion phase. So I think it would be very, very important at some reasonable time before the election that the city would put on for aspiring candidates that there be a total briefing session on that, because you can get disqualified, which is fairly important. If you go to the trouble to get yourself elected and you've committed something along the line that is not in line with the white paper, with the reforms that are being imposed, you're automatically kicked out of office.
All right, thank you, Councillor Lefebvre. So, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I agree with Councillor Lefebvre. It's, especially there will be people that possibly that ran in previous elections and would like to run again in the next ones, and there's some changes there that they need to know about, even little things pertaining to using your signs over again that you used in previous years. So I think that's a good suggestion. My question, Your Worship, may be to you, my fellow councillors. I'm not sure who could answer it, but at the UBCM, I recall that the 4-year term was passed as opposed to the 3-year term, and so I wonder if anybody knows, whether you or the staff knows, if that 4-year term will be coming into effect this year, or if that will be in effect in 2014 or 2017, because I know there's some changes that are coming that will only happen in 2017, but there's a lot of changes that are going to come into play for 2014. So does anybody know the answer to that question?
It's the $64,000 question, although apparently our Director of Administrative Services has the answer. With respect to the 4-year term limits, there was a resolution passed. I was confusing a reporter this very morning on that subject. There was a resolution passed by the UBCM body. In effect, I think it was a 60-40 split to extend our municipal terms to 4 years. And it's not a subject that has not been discussed in the past. In 2010, and I was part of that, I believe we all were, or most of us, there was a resolution defeated on that very subject. The provincial government has always said that they aren't necessarily going to stand in the local government's way, determined, in areas around term limits. They recognize that they'll leave it up to us, in effect. So conceivably, with that resolution now in place, it is certainly setting the stage for our 3-year mandate to become a 4-year mandate, implementation of which I don't believe could occur until probably 2017. But I'll go ahead and let Mr. Manson, who's fingering me over here, an opportunity to speak. With his index finger, of course.
Thank you, Your Worship. Fingering you is a bad choice of words, but anyway. What was passed at UBCM was a UBCM recommendation to the provincial government. The provincial government so far has not made any decision one way or another. the easiest or the earliest that this would come into effect, if indeed it does come into effect, would be the 2017 election.
It's an interesting one because we have seesawed as a collective provincial body back and forth on this. It's not inconceivable that next year a resolution may be passed to go back to a 3-year term, although I got a sense that maybe the crowd's changed a little bit. I have some concerns with that, but I also understand that there's some synergies there too. Getting back to this matter, though, really the question before us is, do we feel the need to comment back to the government or receive the report for information and then through our collective bodies continue our discussions? Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Worship. On that note, staff having much more experience with this type of, I mean, I look at it every 3 years, but staff, at least, and I think I've followed everything that was required of me. But I would ask that would staff be willing to have a cursory look at it so we could maybe talk about it just to see what their, I mean, there are some major changes and they stick out like a sore thumb, but if there are anything in there that staff are being very familiar with what's there now, how maybe just a column and saying, here's what exists, here's what's changing on a page or two, I would like staff to go over that with us, if staff, of course, agree. And I would make that a motion if staff don't agree.
Madam Thomas?
Staff would be happy to do that, Your Worship. But the primary change with this new legislation is really more impactful on the candidates than it is on the people running the election, because it has introduced a new role for Elections BC in monitoring campaign financing and financial issues related to the election. And that is a completely separate departure from what we've had in the past. What they're going to require of candidates to report hasn't been determined yet, but the fundamental change is who is looking after campaign financing and the onus placed on the candidates to report to Elections BC about their finances and how they have funded their election.
All right, Councillor Lefebvre.
So that would, yes, Your Worship, that would be my specific request, to sort of have a column, what exists now, what are the major changes, and what does that mean for the candidates?
All right, so in that case, we can likely just receive, and we can direct staff just to provide a report back. Go ahead, Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just had a quick comment. I sat in on that session. I know a lot of the main concerns were around the necessity to put the sponsors' names on everything. I mean, I don't think any of us have outside sponsorship when we ran for election anyway, but the necessity to put Vote for Pete, paid for by Pete on absolutely everything was there. They didn't seem to have a good answer as to what was sponsored and what was donated, and so there's definitely some things that need to be looked at. I'm sure staff will find that for us.
Well, if you receive this, there's nothing to prevent you from at some point in the near future directing staff to provide comment back to the provincial government with respect to this. So maybe it's a combination of getting a report back from staff on sort of the Reader's Digest version of some of the reforms that are more applicable to our concerns, and then formulating a response if that is something. Yeah, Cole's notes would be the appropriate term. So if that's something that is acceptable to council, we can simply vote to receive at this time. All right, question from Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Am I correct in recalling that the opportunity to respond expires in a couple of days? Was it not a September 23rd deadline? October 23rd. Actually, isn't today? What is today? Sorry. Today's the 23rd.
Still in September.
Okay, and just further through you, Your Worship, to staff, in addition to looking at interpreting this report, I would also ask that you include some of the possible changes that we might see in 2017 as well as 2014. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to now call it on the motion to receive. And will you require an actual motion to draft that report? I'm looking at you, or you. You will. All right. Trying to move this on. Okay, let's put that under new business, and I'll look for that motion at the time. Keep it simple, and we'll just get a report back. All right. All those in favor of receipt? Opposed and carried. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, moving on to our item G under reports, which is again from the Director of Administrative Services, and this is the 2013 Fall Grant in Aid applications. And Mrs. Thomas, if you could give us a very quick summation.
Yes, Your Worship. The purpose of this report is to request Council initiate the process for reviewing and awarding the semi-annual community grants, and the recommendations are as per the Council agenda.
All right, so we have a recommendation there. Do we have a mover and a seconder for said recommendation? Moved by Councillor Morrison, seconded by Councillor Powell-Davidson, and open it to discussion. I think we're missing someone here. We'll be having a discussion. Nonetheless, I'm going to suggest that likely the folks that would be appointed would be yourself, Councillor Powell-Davidson, and our comrade here, Councillor Powell. I suppose we could make that a friendly amendment to this motion, I believe. So with those, that quick friendly amendment, if no one objects, I'll call it. All in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, moving on to our next item, item H, and this is regarding permissive taxation exemptions, and it's a report from the Director of Administrative Services. Mrs. Thomas, could you give us the background, please?
Yes, Your Worship. The purpose of this report is to present for Council's consideration the applications for 2014 property tax exemptions. Staff have prepared the report in accordance with the requirements of the Community Charter and the newly adopted Council Policy Number 6.15. The property tax exemption bylaw must be adopted by October 31st of this year in order to grant exemptions in the 2014 taxation year. The recommendations are as per the Council agenda.
So we do have a recommendation there. Is there a member of Council prepared to move that recommendation? Councillor Morrison, is there a seconder? Councillor Lefebvre. So the recommendation or motion now is on the floor, and I'll open it to discussion, questions, or comments. So I'm going to see Councillor Morrison as the mover. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick clarification. The motion as recommended, does that include the 50% for the public park and recreation, or is that the full 100% for those?
Yeah, that would be at 50%. Exemption for those categories there that you mentioned, which is in accordance with the policies that have been passed. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. When I was reading my report when I got back on Friday night from UBCM, I noted that as Council liaison to the Oceanside Community Arts Council, that they had not filled all of the requirements. In other words, the financial audit is missing. The financial statements for last year and are required. I notified two members of the board immediately by email and by phone, and I'm told as late as this morning that that was simply an oversight, and the person that can extract that information is out of town, but that information will be available tomorrow morning. So I guess my question is, what impact, given that that statement's only going to get into the hands of staff tomorrow morning, what impact does this have, given that they haven't complied with the request? Does it mean that they're automatically ejected or eliminated from the potential for the permissive taxation?
No, Your Worship.
Mrs. Thomas?
This is, Your Worship, through to Councillor Lefebvre. These permissive tax exemptions are completely at Council's discretion. So if Council wishes to include the OCAC property in the tax exemption bylaw, they can certainly do that and ask for the information to be submitted afterwards, but it is completely at Council's discretion.
Well, Your Worship, I'll be doing that obviously because through no fault of their own, they did fill out the form, but the attachment for some reason wasn't forthcoming. But it's there, and it's in the from what I'm told from one of the board members I talked to this morning, it's there, but they just have to get it out of the system. So I would recommend that. Yes, I'm going to
go ahead, Mr. Manson.
If I may, Your Worship, I'll just point out that Staff anticipated this, and it's already on Schedule A.
Thank you. Because all I saw was blanks on my page, and I got a little worried.
All right, so just so we're clear then, with respect to the actual motion that's before us, this particular organization, the OCAC, have been essentially qualified due to the fact that you do have that information pending and or already in, assuming that you would have that information. Okay, all right, very good. Okay, further comments? Go ahead, Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. I have some concern looking at the column financial information received, and the date of the financial information and who it was prepared by, and when I look at it, quite often I see unclear, no name, who it was prepared by, unclear, internal, unknown. I mean, these are some significant things. I was really surprised that the Royal Canadian Legion has internal-only financial data. I guess what I would like to see is a statement by Council saying, if you really want to have the benefit of a permissive tax exemption, we'd like to see your financial data, and we'd like it to be as clear as possible, either done by a CGA audit firm or a CA firm. And that's going to cost you money, but in fact, it's going to be a benefit to us to make a decision, and it's going to be a benefit to you to see exactly where you're going. Unless you have this sort of financial data, you really aren't operating very effectively, in my opinion. You have to know what you've got before you know what you're capable of doing. And I'm kind of surprised at some of this. We look at the Historical Society. The Historical Society has got $1 million, and they can well service the situation if they were to be cut off. They have internal...
Councillor Neufeld, you're not reading from the confidential documents, right?
I guess the comment that I would make, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, okay. It's public knowledge that they do have that.
That is public knowledge, but just so you're aware,
yeah.
Some of these documents are confidential. Yeah. Just for your information, ladies and gentlemen, as part of this process, Council has been furnished with some confidential financial information as well. But go ahead, just be wary of that.
Yeah. What I'm saying is, I would like to see it standardized as to what was to be expected, so that there is a certain set of data, how it's going to be done. There's going to be an audit process, and it's going to be prepared by a third party. And that's what I would be looking for, and I would hope that that's what we would have in the future. I'm willing to accept this at the present time.
So what I would suggest, Councillor Neufeld, what you would want to do then in that sort of case is to bring forward at some point here a motion to amend the policy that's already in place, and then put provisions in there for additional financial reporting requirements over and above what's already established. I think that would be the correct procedure forward.
Today,
I appreciate that.
In the future.
I appreciate that. So, and again, just for the background of those that are in the room, so of course you're probably all well aware that we went through quite a period of time where we discussed establishing a new policy regarding permissive tax exemptions, and that was ultimately brought forward by a Citizens Advisory Committee and then adopted by Council. Now, of course, is the first test of that, as this is now permissive tax season, if you will. And as you can see in the recommendation to a degree, and Council is a little bit more aware of it due to some of the confidential information, there are some impacts associated with the new policy on a number of organizations that are typically recipients of tax exemptions. And in some cases, it's reducing exemptions in 4 cases, I believe, predominantly in recreation, down to 50% as opposed to the traditional 100%. So that means that 50% of the municipal portion is exempted, but they are still required to pay the other half. And ultimately, as well, there are potentially changes that could be seen as detrimental. However, you will recall in the policy we were seeking to set a target, a certain amount per year, Now, if council were uncomfortable with this policy, you can. There's nothing to say that you have to follow your own policies, although it would be somewhat unusual given that's just been adopted. You could essentially just give issue, or rather instruction to staff through a motion to provide a 100% exemption to all the applicants. That would be, of course, a situation that would push us up well above that plateau that we're trying to set, and it would be something that staff would have to budget for accordingly. If you look again in the actual report, based on some of the changes that are reflected in that recommendation, it does keep us about $2,000 roughly below the level of $225,000 in tax exemptions this year, based on the changes there. Just wanted to give that background, more so for the folks in the room that may have not had opportunity to read all that. So, furthermore, any further discussion on this motion before us? Okay, I'll call it. All in favor? Opposed is carried unanimously. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're now moving into the bylaws section of our meeting, and we have one bylaw for second reading tonight, and that's with respect to Zoning and Development Amendment Bylaw 2013, number 2000.90, and that's regarding small lot residential SLR1 at 780 Stanhope Road. And the recommendation is to provide second reading. Do we have a mover? Moved by Councillor Morrison, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Probably don't require discussion. All in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Or read a second time, rather. And now moving into the two readings phase of our meeting tonight, we have one bylaw for first and second reading tonight, and that is the Inter-Community Business License Bylaw 2013, number 14.99, and that, just for a refresher, is a bylaw to establish a scheme for inter-community licensing and regulation of trades, occupation, and businesses. A big subject, actually, of the UBCM. I think we're a little ahead of the curve on this one. Do we have a mover and a seconder to read that twice? Moved by Councillor Neufeld, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. And now we're moving into the new business section, and there is one item that's actually on the agenda. Why don't we deal with that first, and then I'll open the floor to members of council regarding any new business and or motions you might want to bring forward. So this is regarding a recommendation that the city contribute $200 towards a Sky's the Limit auction package for the 29th Annual Parksville Chamber of Commerce Fantasy Auction, and that the funding be provided from our council contingency fund. So I have a mover in Councillor Powell-Davidson, seconders Councillor Morrison. Any discussion? All right, seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. And I will open the floor to items of new business. And why don't we start with Councillor Lefebvre? There's one relating to the RDN, and then if there's anyone else, well, make sure you have an opportunity here. Actually, what I'll do is I will ask for a motion. I'll read it. This is essentially the motion that Councillor Mark Lefebvre, in his capacity as the city's representative on the Regional District of Nanaimo, be directed to propose a motion at the next regular Regional District of Nanaimo Board meeting to request that the Regional District ask the Island Corridor Foundation to provide confirmation that all rail lines current under active use meet all BC and federal safety requirements for rail transportation. And further, that in the event such confirmation cannot be provided, the ICF suspend all rail transportation activities within the City of Parksville boundaries until such safety requirements are met. So it's, why don't we let someone else second that? Councillor Neufeld, I actually need a mover, so you want to move that, Councillor Neufeld? Okay, do we have a seconder? All right, Councillor Morrison seconded, so discussion on that. You can certainly participate, you just happen to be our representative there. I think, ladies and gentlemen, what this is referring to, we're actually, it's no secret, we've got some serious concerns with the Island Corridor Foundation, its management structure. You've been hearing and probably reading about that in a number of places. That's not for a moment to suggest we would not love to see a robust rail system along that entire corridor, and that is still ultimately our goal. The way the structure works is it's 5 regional districts, 14 First Nations that actually govern this organization. It's not the specific municipality, hence why we are utilizing our director at the RDN level to bring forward this motion should it pass. And the reason why we're bringing that forward is our tracks are looking like they're in really rough shape. I mean, really rough. and we still have freight movement on those tracks beyond our second crossing here at the Alberni Highway. It does travel through two well fields. It does ultimately cross the Englishman River, and without any real assurance that those safety standards are being met, and with an inability to even find out what the liability coverages are, you can appreciate our concern. We don't want to see a situation like has occurred in Quebec, and we don't want to leave the city exposed. So that is the basis for this resolution. In background, we are also pursuing a number of additional questions in another resolution that's not public, unfortunately, because there's some legal elements at the regional district level as well. So this would sort of append on to that, and hopefully we will be able to get some answers. Long story long. So any further comments from members of council on this particular item? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Yes, you can have that. All right, so items of new business. I see Councillor Powell-Davidson. We'll start there. We'll make sure everyone has an opportunity. Go ahead, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. In the interest of keeping this afternoon short, I won't give my prepared report on the UBCM today. I'll save that for another time. However, earlier this afternoon, you did refer to a farm bylaw that would regulate or quantify activities on farms, and I was wondering if you might share a little bit more about that we could consider asking staff to go forward and preparing a resolution for that, or if we would be prepared to put one in there today, because I'm interested in possibly considering that farm bylaw.
Okay, so perhaps I could turn it over to our planning department just for a second, just to touch on basically the element of the report that talks about the possibility of an additional regulatory farm bylaw, and then it would simply require a motion to direct staff to provide a report back, and we would have a much clearer understanding. Mr. Russell?
If your Your Worship, that's just what I was going to suggest, that basically a motion, if that's what council is interested in, to bring forward a motion that staff investigate and develop a report on the topic of a farm bylaw and make recommendations accordingly.
Did you want to make that motion? Okay, so Councillor Powell-Davidson, do we have a seconder on that motion? No seconder on the motion for a report on the possibility of establishing an extra regulatory bylaw around farm operations in and around urban environments and close to city center. Seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. So discussion on the motion. Go ahead, Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Given the limited amount of farm land that we have in the area, I'm just wondering, I realize it's just a staff report, I'm just wondering how much time we're spending on excuse me, establishing a bylaw on something that's very limited scope and within the city, and how much does that fall under bylaws then? Are we going to be needing more bylaw enforcement for what people are allowed to do along the farmland?
I think the general premise behind this, and it would be, had you been in that chair for some time, you probably would have understood the issues that we've gone through in the past with some of the farm properties here, where there have been threats about pig farms, cattle farms, chicken farms. You know, it becomes almost a process where there's a lot of animosity involved, and I think by having an additional regulatory bylaw specifically to do with these types of applications, or at least what is permissible and isn't, and to knock out some of the sort of incorrect information that's out there regarding Right to Farm Act, etc., it might serve us very well moving forward, so that when we move into these types of discussions, there's not really a whole lot of, well, if we don't get our way, we're going to do this or that. It'll be very clearly understood exactly what is permissible and what isn't, notwithstanding that it is absolutely more workload, for sure. I don't see it so much as an enforcement issue, it's just having that level of regulatory control over and above. To answer your question, okay? All right, thank you. Any further comments on the motion that's now before us? It would be for a report to come back, not the actual drafting of the bylaw, simply a report to provide you with options on that. Okay, so I'll call it. All in favor? Opposed? It's carried unanimously. Thank you. Okay, so that was yourself, Councillor Powell-Davidson. So, Councillor Neufeld, did you have something you wanted to add?
Thanks very much, Your Worship. Basically, this was something that I was thinking about. We've had an incredibly busy fall start to the fall. September has been extremely busy, what with UBCM, and all kinds of other activities that each of us personally, severally, and individually have been involved with. And I don't know if all of our residents are aware of some of the things that take up our time. And I was going to list some of them, and if you don't mind, I'm going to take just a few minutes to run down some of the things that I know that you and I and some of the other councillors have been doing very quickly. This has been a busy time. We've had, since our last open meeting, we've had 2.5 weeks of really heavy slogging as far as I'm concerned. Now, maybe I'm getting old and I don't suffer with it as well as the younger people, but in fact, you and Councillor Powell-Davidson and I attended the opening of the Labyrinth at the hovercraft site in the community park, and then proceeded to walk through that setting. Following that, within a day or two, on the 7th and 8th, there was a Chinese Moon Festival, which was held in the community park, and if you weren't there, you missed a tremendous spectacle as far as some magnificent kites. And that Chinese Moon Festival celebrates the beginning of the Chinese harvest, which is coincidental with the full moon. On May 8th, most of, Mayor and Council wound up walking through Resort Drive for the art, food, and music of the vendors from near and far. All the resorts participated, and they should be applauded for putting on the party on the drive. And the councillor to my left here was the event manager and was responsible for a good party. It was really quite enjoyable. Thank you. The 9th and 12th, occasionally a couple of in-camera sessions that will, in fact, will be brought about so that the residents do know about it in the near future. One of the things that I did personally, I had a meeting with a very good friend of mine, an old-time person up in Quadra Island, and we wound up, you were not party, the council was not party to it, but I wound up, he was the superintendent of Metro Toronto Works, and we discussed many of the issues relating to water and water management and wastewater management. So that was some of the stuff that I wound up doing. In addition to that, I continue to volunteer at the Parksville Senior Center in the morning, and that was on the 13th. On the 14th, I spent 5 hours in Nanaimo having a really enjoyable time with the Vancouver Island Regional Library, and Councillor Powell is the normal candidate for that, and she was not able to make it, so I wound up going as the alternate. And they have a fantastic group that they work with. There are about 40 people from all over the island, all over the region, I should say, that attended, and a really good organization, well attended, and well utilized as far as the time was concerned, and how they operate that system. The system itself is unique. We are not only growing, when I say we, they are growing the facility as far as bricks and mortar are concerned with 8 brand new buildings that are community attractions for knowledge, art, culture, and social activities. And unfortunately, however, VIRL is not being supported as well as it might be, such as the example of the Canadian federal government not providing monies contributing to the operations of the locations such as in Haida Gwaii, where VRIL provides a tremendous service for the community there. So that was one of the really important and significant things that I was involved with. The 15th to the 20th was the Union of BC Municipalities, and that was tremendous. I wound up spending a great deal of time. I missed a few meetings through my own fault, but there was so much to do and contribute to that I don't think it was missed. On the 21st, I attended an open house for the Canadian Forces based in Nanu's, meeting Commander Powell, the base commander, and many of his staff. And there was a SARS demonstration using a cormorant helicopter, transferring a medic down to a moving craft on the water. Really a very dynamic and thrilling spectacle. If you haven't seen it, it's worthwhile when they put on another show. that same afternoon, there was a global picnic to draw awareness to head injury. The picnic started in New Zealand and moved around the globe, ending in Hawaii, and Parksville participated. We have a number of people, Jessica Taylor being the person who looked after it here. And yesterday, Toronto Dominion Bank, with their TD, meaning Trees Day, Toronto Dominion Canada Trust, with Ray Caston as the coordinator, and 4 of our city staff, those 4 being Warren Payne, Kevin Campbell, Kim Becerra, and Annie, pardon me for mispronouncing that, M.A. Hersley, who participated in planting 250 trees. Really a dynamic community, and I think that we should applaud ourselves for the things that we do and the things that we participate in as a council and as a community and as people who came out. The Girl Guides and the Scouts supported it. There were others that were out yesterday as far as the volunteer action, and we had a grand time in the rain. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councillor. Any further comments for new business? I have one more, so well, we'll get back to you in a moment. Thank you for that motion earlier. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have two notices of motion to make, but before I do, I want to make just a very quick comment about the Union of British Columbia Municipalities Conference we all attended last week. I can't tell you how proud I am to be a Canadian, to have somebody like Stephen Lewis working on our behalf and Canada's behalf in the United Nations, and all the work that he does for HIV/AIDS in the African countries. I was terribly impressed and moved by his presentation, and I didn't want it to end. He's a fascinating individual, and I think he represents what Canada should be all about, not buying fighter jets and that sort of thing, but helping these other nations that are in desperate need of help. And what struck me is that if you've got something to complain about, listen to Stephen Lewis and let him tell you the stories about the babies that are dying from AIDS in Africa and the grandmothers that are looking after these orphan children whose parents have died from AIDS. And it might kind of put things in perspective for everybody. And I'm thankful every day that in the divine plan somewhere that I was born and raised in Canada. Enough of that. I felt very strongly about it. My first notice of motion would be that staff prepare a report on the proposed changes in the election reform white paper, and when finalized, hold information sessions for all aspiring candidates prior to the election of 2014. My second notice of motion would be that that the City of Parksville support the 100% relaxation of DCCs and fees similar to the Alliance Hustwick Plate projects for the Kingsley Low Rental Housing Society. I'll throw those out there.
And that is a notice of motion? Okay. Is that it, Councillor Lefebvre?
That's it.
All right, thank you very much. So moving around the table, anyone else? Councillor Morrison, so go ahead, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I will be brief. I couldn't let this day go by without celebrating. Back to the UBCM for just a sec. I just want to let everybody know that Parksville did send forward a resolution. It was passed. We sent it forward to the Association of Vancouver Island Coastal Communities, which is the process we have to follow. That got passed, and it was taken forward to the Union of BC Municipalities to bring forward to the province, and that got passed. This is something I'm very, very excited about. It is us at the local government level putting pressure with absolutely no reasons of excuse, nothing. We are absolutely adamant that we want the province to respond to our emergency coordinators in the event of an earthquake or a tsunami immediately. This 2 to 4 hours that we saw last fall is not acceptable, so we fought hard for that. We've pushed it forward, and I look forward to reporting back to you when we finally do get a system in place that reports to our emergency coordinators immediately, not in 2 to 4 hours. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that spirited report. The only other item, I think, before we can call adjournment is regarding something that I think a couple, at least of us, became aware of. One of the sessions during this last conference we had was on essentially how do we better interact with you folks, the public, in different manners and methods. And one of the topics within that session was about the question and answer period, which, as we were about to embark on, we typically do offer. There's not a requirement there. It's more of a courtesy, but it's to provide the public with a chance to ask questions, and often statements disguised as questions on matters that we are discussing. It became apparent in that discussion that it seems like most municipalities actually do that at the beginning of the meeting as opposed to the end of the meeting for a variety of rationale, but not least of which is that this is a time when the public can comment prior to the actual decisions being made in some cases. So it is a matter of simply the agenda, and I have the authority to amend that agenda and change that as a mayor. However, as you know, I prefer to go into this with the support of council. And I know I've talked with a couple of you just in passing which seem to indicate support, but do you folks feel, do my fellow council members feel that this might be something worthy of trying? And how I anticipate that would work is that, obviously not tonight, but say in the next meeting, we make an opportunity for the public to ask questions and comments, I suppose, up to a limited period of time, obviously, and then we would commence the regular meeting. And if there is something that's been asked at that time, there may be opportunity actually to take that into consideration and or be able to answer that during the actual course of the meeting itself. So if I don't see anyone wagging their fingers at me, no one's upset, then I'll go ahead and make that change for the next agenda. Sound good? Okay, I see everybody's agreeing. Very good. All right, so in that case, then, I'm just going to ask one more thing of you all, and that is a motion to adjourn. So moved by Councillor Powell-Davidson, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. We stand adjourned. And regarding any of the items on tonight's agenda, is there any questions from the audience? All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and you get the night off. Congratulations.